out of breath. London calling, and I don't want to shout. But while we were talking, I saw you coming out. London calling, see, we ain't got no hide. Except for that one with the yellowy eyes. The accent is coming, the sun's zooming in. Into economic, the wheat is going big. A nuclear error, but I have no clear. Cause London is drowning out. I live by the river.
Hi, everybody. Let's get started. My name is Jessica Katz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. First off, I want to thank our sponsors for today's event, Santander, M&T Bank, as well as the Ford Foundation and the Neighborhoods First Fund who helped fund the study trip to London, which inspired this event today. Before we dive in, each time I get in front of a group of New Yorkers, I just want to start by telling you all to fill out your census form. I don't want anyone in the Zoom room who hasn't filled out their census. So mostly I want you paying attention to us, but for now, take a pause. If you haven't done so, fill out your form, text your friends, and make sure that they fill out their form. This is actually, if you're a New Yorker, it's the most important act of democracy that you'll be participating in this year. Do it right now. All right, I'm pleased to be joined today by three phenomenal women who are changing the landscape for public housing on two different continents. The Honorable Alicka Ampry-Samuel, council member from Brooklyn, chair of the Public Housing Committee and formerly of NYCHA, as well as Clare Devine and Daniela Mecozzi from Arc-Atelier, a design firm in the UK that specializes in tenant engagement in council housing, or what we here call public housing. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today and taking the time to share your knowledge and perspective. So first, I want to share something about the other projects that CHPC has been working on that inspired this event today. We recently published a piece called The Final Countdown. This mayoral administration has 15 months left, and we have 5 policies that we think they can enact in the next 15 months to really leave a lasting legacy of progress and results. So that's rezoning Soho, focus on equitable code enforcement, regulatory reform for basement apartments, enable resident decision-making at NYCHA, which is what we're spotlighting here today, and affordable housing for essential workers. We also did a project about housing policy in a global pandemic. We have 12 housing policies that we thought would be really critical to help the city recover both in our health and our economy after a global pandemic like the coronavirus. One in particular that I want to highlight is our work on population density and COVID-19. So there have been a lot of people blaming urban density, but in fact, it's not the case. Blaming density is harmful to our recovery, and it's downright deadly to people who live in less dense areas who think that they're safe and that this is a New York problem. So check out our work on population density and COVID when you hear people saying kind of thoughtlessly that New York City was built for transmission or that they're safer someplace with less people. It's just not true. And then moving on to the next mayoral administration, we want to make sure that the next mayor creates a housing plan that leads with our values, that defines what our housing problems are and works towards a set of housing policies from there, as opposed to starting with a unit target and then backing into the housing policy. So to that end, we've created 6 different lenses of what the housing policy could look like and look at what a plan could be if our plan was solely for a housing plan for a city of immigrants. What does a feminist housing plan look like? What is a housing plan exclusively to advance racial equity? And if your housing plan was to create health of New Yorkers, what would that look like? And how would that be different from the current approach? We have 2 upcoming events I want to talk to you about. On Thursday, October 1st, we are launching our housing plan for a city of immigrants. We're going to publish the housing plan of what it would look like if the purpose of the plan was to honor our past, present, and future as a city of immigrants. And then on Thursday, October 15th, we're doing an event that I affectionately call What the F is a Feminist Housing Plan. So we hope you'll all join us for those 2 as well. So on to the public housing revolution. In 2019, CHPC published a report and hosted a week of events when a group of experts from London visited New York to help share their experiences in public housing regeneration. That panel discussion is available on YouTube for anyone who wants a deeper overview of what happened in London. So I'll just provide a quick overview here today. There's some NYCHA resources on our website that I want to direct you to. The Public Housing Revolution report. We have a tenant engagement toolkit that looks at the actual primary source documents that were used in the UK for public housing regeneration, as they call it, as well as a program evaluation of the Triborough transfer, which is sort of an early stage RAD transaction here in New York City, where CHPC was a program evaluator. We did a survey of hundreds and hundreds of public housing residents, both those who are living in the Triborough buildings and a control group who are not living in the Triborough buildings, and the results were really quite stark. So I encourage you to check that out. So why London? There are some important differences and some important similarities about why CHPC chose to focus on public housing in London as an example of what we could do here in New York to improve our public housing. So we think of ourselves as being too big, too complicated, too bureaucratic to really get anything done at times. But in fact, London had more than 4 times as much public housing. In the 1980s, there were 800,000 units of public housing in London to our 174,000. Another big difference, however, is that when here, only about 5% of New York City's population lives in public housing. So despite how big our portfolio is compared to other places in the US, in London, 1 in 3 Londoners in the 80s lived in a public housing or council housing unit. The population size was approximately the same, but there was a big demographic difference where more than half of New York City is non-white, but only about 20% of London was non-white. So it was a much whiter city at that time, and many more white people lived in public housing, which accounted for some differences, which we'll talk about in a bit. Another big difference was the structure of the government itself. So while here, obviously, we have one single housing authority, NYCHA, in London in the 1980s, there are 33 different housing authorities. So they're structured similar to imagine if each council member was sort of the mayor of their own neighborhood and had their own housing authority that they had to manage and they were responsible for. So on the one hand, each housing authority was much smaller and had fewer resources. On the other hand, the local elected official in the legislative body had much more responsibility over that, and also created an opportunity for the councils to each have a distinct neighborhood-based approach that didn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. So here are some of the reasons, both the similarities and the differences, why we thought it was helpful to compare public housing in New York City and London. And again, we did a series of events on this last year, so I encourage you to check those out. We talked about the role of an independent tenant advisor. So there's an entire profession in the UK called an independent tenant advisor, whose sole role is to guide all the stakeholders involved through a regeneration plan, or what a redevelopment, or some, for example, such as a RAD that we would refer to here, through a different menu of options to ensure that everybody in the decision-making process has complete and unbiased information, and they can be used at all stages depending on the needs of the housing provider. So we were very excited after the Londoners had come to New York City. We really wanted to see the results up close. So we brought together a diverse group of public housing stakeholders, resident leaders, advocacy groups, developers, and government, so we could all go together, kick the tires, and learn about the promising policies, ideas that we'd learned about only from afar. So we went to London. We heard about their successes in public housing regeneration and saw it for ourselves. We met with tenants and developers, architects, and government officials. Today, we'll hear reflections from our trip to London and ideas about how we can implement these ideas right here at home. And particularly for the architects and the developers in the room, I have a question for you. I want to challenge you to think about how you could orient your work so that public housing residents, not government, not funders, are your client. We learned so much on this trip, and I'd like to pause and introduce Councilmember Alicka Ampry-Samuel, and we'd love to start by hearing your reflections on our trip to London together. Thanks so much, Alicka.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Jessica. This is This is a great, great, great opportunity to discuss London. You know, it's now September. It'll be almost a year that, you know, since we had that trip over, and a lot has happened since that time, right? And you made me just think about just every emotion that I had in my, and then thinking back, just thinking now, every emotion that I've had over the past several months during this whole pandemic, and thinking, gosh, you know, things would be different if, you know, if the residents had more of a voice, if the residents were more in leadership, right? And so, and looking at the screen for a few seconds where it says public housing revolution kept jumping out at me because I feel like we're in like this revolutionary moment in time. And so for me, my theme for 2020 is the takeover of residents, right? And what would that look like? And so, so I'm just telling you how my brain works. So the takeover part for my personal theme of 2020 made me think back to, and we had this conversation just a little while ago before we got started, when we first walked into the town hall, Hackney Town Hall, and met with the Mayor Philip Glanville, right? And there was a resident there who is part of the team. And when you go into City Hall and you meet with the mayor, you automatically, you know, have this entire perspective of, okay, so the mayor's going to talk, and then, you know, probably some other government folks, and then the residents will speak after, like we normally do in New York. But it was different because the mayor immediately looked at David, right?
Jeff, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, there was so many people. Jeff, I'm not even looking at my notes, but sorry. So the mayor looked at Jeff and said, this is your meeting. You know, like you're leading. And so, and we had a brief, you know, like little ha-ha moment where it's like, what if the mayor of New York looked at a resident in a meeting and said, this is your meeting, you lead? That has never happened, and it will never happen under this structure that we currently have. The concept just does not exist in New York. And for me, that's the real difference between New York and London. And that really gets at the essence and the spirit of what we need to do, and what I got out of my experiences in London is allowing the residents to lead. And not even allowing them to lead, like how are we allowing them, right? No, accepting the fact that the residents are the leaders, and falling back and providing them, you know, setting up a structure where they are supposed to be leading. And so I think that is what the overall takeaway is. I have, you know, several points that I noticed and I would like to discuss this morning. But for me, the big piece of it is the resident takeover, a real revolution, and the fact that in London, it was just that, the residents led. And it took some time to get there, but they were able to figure it out. And those are the lessons that we are able to learn, and we don't have to stumble. You know, we can take those lessons and figure out how to bake it into a New York model, but it starts with the residents leading the process.
Yeah, I think for me, there was two really jaw-dropping moments when we were in London. One was, as you said, we walked into this big wood-paneled room. It was a very familiar kind of city hall, pomp and circumstance space, and the big Georgian columns outside. And we meet with the mayor, and they're giving us, you know, the swag from the city and the tote bags, and, you know, it all felt very familiar. And then all of a sudden, the mayor turned to the public housing tenant and said, Jeff, what would you like to talk about? This is your meeting. And you could tell that they were friends, and you could tell that they worked together for a long time. And you could tell that they were kind of evenly matched in terms of their power in that room. Mm-hmm. So that was really remarkable. And I enjoyed seeing your mouth pop open in that moment as well.
And it was, and also too, I love the fact that Phyllis was there, that Miss Barbara was there, you know, Miss Barbara from Polo Ground, Phyllis from Tilden Houses, you know, they were able to see that. And that was truly an awakening moment.
Yeah, and then the second moment that I remember is when one of the residents that we met with said, you know, we met with all these architects and we interviewed them all and we picked the one that we liked the best. And it was like, and then he just moved on. It was like, whoa, 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 whoa. It was like a record scratch, move back. Who picked the architect? And they said, well, we did. And they found that completely unremarkable. And so today, that's part of what we're calling for in CHPC's report that came out last week, is for the city to really take the next 15 months that they have left in this administration and really double down on not just resident engagement. The residents have been engaged enough. They have no reason to engage with an administration that doesn't keep its promises, but in fact, to actually create some real resident decision making. We have a list of architects we know can do the job already. We have a pre-qualified list of developers we know can do the job already. There's thousands and thousands of NYCHA units. There will be plenty of work for everybody. I just don't see why the residents themselves can't be the ones to select who the best partner is for them. And I'm so excited to see what happens when the development community and the affordable housing community in New York City reorients their work towards what a resident wants to see, as opposed to what a project manager at a government agency wants to see.
You know what's interesting too, I think another difference between New York and London is the fact that we always start from, no, we cannot do this. It's against, procurement rules or confidentiality. And we don't start from, okay, what can we do to make it work? And we don't take the time to sit there and figure it out. And there's a lot of smart people around the table, but because we're always in a hurry to get something done, we just don't take that time. And so I appreciate the fact that, you all have laid it out and said, this is what, within the 15 months that you have left, this is what you need to focus on, right? To get things done, because we can't afford to continue to start from the, no, this can't happen, and this is the only space that we can make available to get things done. And, it's just not appropriate anymore at all. And it also made me think about the fact that we went to that tenant scrutiny conference. And I'm not sure if we're going to talk about that at some point, but that was another space where it's called Tenant Scrutiny Conference. And it was just that literally the tenants were able to participate in the scrutinizing of the council housing and, just public housing developments that took place. And I'm speaking about a way forward and a vision and what would they like to see next. But first, let's discuss what happened, provide feedback and input, and then talk about what we've done, what was good, what did not make sense, and how do we use this information moving forward for the next level or the next phase of development. And it was a real conference. We would never do that here, because you talk about transparency, that was real transparency, and we need the ability and space to have honest conversations with residents and government and developers in a way that we can all learn from and really develop in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, they had really moved past this adversarial relationship between the tenants and the government and the tenants and the developers, and really moved to a place where tenant scrutiny, it was almost like how you have a comment card at a business or something, right? It was a feedback loop for the developers and the property managers to know whether or not they were providing the right kind of services. And it was just a way for them to learn about how they needed to improve their work and what was working and what wasn't. So it wasn't always friendly, but it got past this everyone kind of entrenched in their corners moment where everyone was working together towards a common purpose, at least. Mm-hmm. So that was really remarkable. And even just the phrase tenant scrutiny, it's such a throwaway phrase to the point where it was so common, they literally have a nationwide conference in the UK about this. We traveled to Birmingham to this tenant scrutiny conference, and it was all about these tiny nuances about how to improve tenant scrutiny. Whereas we were like, tenant what? I mean, that's like a remarkable concept to think about. And they really had embedded in every step of the way the fact that residents are not just like a constituency to be won over or a barrier to be overcome, but actually do have real expertise about where they live and are the only source of that expertise. So who do you go to find out if the lawn's getting mowed on time? You ask the tenants. Who do you go to find out what the security issues are in the building? You don't hire a consultant, you ask the tenants. So on the one hand, we do have some concerns that puts a lot of pressure on time of the residents themselves. But on the other hand, it really did elevate that they had an expertise and wasn't just paying that lip service. But I want to ask you, Alicka, what surprised you the most when we were there?
Well, the first thing that surprised me the most, and you spoke to a little bit in your slide, was the fact that most of the public housing residents were white, and a lot of the leadership were, folks that were. I just didn't see a lot of, Black people, or people, just people of color there. And in fact, when I went to the tenant scrutiny conference, I was looking around the hall to be able to approach, certain individuals to ask them, like, what's happening here? But then I realized that one woman said to me, oh, we're here, well, some of us are just working right now, you don't see us. But then too, the demographics is just different in London. And then it made me think, well, are they having so much, I don't want to say success, but are they able to move the needle forward because it's, predominantly white people, right? But then I had to kind of, just kind of think and just think about the process and the fact that it's public housing and the fact that the buildings were all like very similar. You had towers and they had elevator issues. They had mold issues. They had overcrowding concerns. And so it mirrored all of the issues that we have in New York City. And so I was able to kind of get past the fact that I met with more white people. And then I was able to say, it's a very similar conversation, and we can continue to learn and figure out ways to implement what they're doing in London, in New York City, regardless of the fact that, the demographics are different. But what also struck out to me was when we went to Finsbury Park. It was there was a water feature, and there was like a lake. I think it might have been like a man-made lake of some sort. And there was a very, very, very strong Hasidic Jewish community there. And it reminded me of my side of Crown Heights. I represent a portion of the Crown Heights community, which is Hasidic Jewish families, and we live right next door to, a very diverse community. And just having conversations with those constituencies as well. And so it was, for me, it was just the fact that there were so many similarities. And it was just like a no-brainer to be able to implement, some of the best practices that we see there. And another big thing too was the fact that when we went to Hackney Town Hall, where the mayor is, but in the back of the building was their, in a sense, borough hall. And all of their agencies are housed in this one building. And the mayor explained that, oh, this is where everyone comes for services. So there's no sense of going into Manhattan and, to City Hall with the municipal building, and everyone is there and supporting all 5 boroughs. In a sense, I'm in Brooklyn, so the families in Brooklyn will go to Brooklyn Borough Hall where the borough president is, right? And the municipal building that's across the street from the borough hall in your individual boroughs. It would make sense to have that type of structure here, because it would cut out all of the centralization that we see. So for me, in a nutshell, I was surprised at the fact that it was so similar, but the demographics were different. But when you boil it down, it goes back to the fact that, we need to be able to be supportive of families in public and council housing, no matter what the color is.
Yeah. I mean, you could see how having a much larger white population in public housing would have, in some kind of sad sense, made it easier for the power structures in London to sit across the table from a public housing resident and say, what do you want? What do you need? Let's negotiate. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time that we let racism get in the way of good public policy here in New York. But to me, that's just all the more reason why we have to fight past this and get to a point where we here can really recognize the expertise of residents and bring them to the table to really have an even standing in terms of what we want to do next. And frankly, we've seen very little progress on public housing with this administration. So the top-down approach is not working. That we'll tell you what we're working on when we're done working on it is not working. So this is just another thing that we can try here in New York that can help us move past this. So, thank you so much for your leadership. And we know you're going to continue to fight the good fight on behalf of NYCHA residents. Thank you so much, Alicka. So before we move on to the next speaker, I have a question to ask the architects here today. If I called you right now and said, guess what? Great news. I won the lottery. Jessica won the lottery. I need you to design my dream home. Think about what questions you need to ask me. What would you need to know about me and my family and my lifestyle and my household in order to design that dream home for me? And now think about how we could translate that to finding out from a public housing resident what a public housing resident needs in a renovation of their homes. For the developers in the room, what if when you submitted your response to an RFP for an infill site, for a RAD deal, for an HPD property, what if when you submitted your RFP, instead of being interviewed by a project manager from a government agency, you were interviewed by a group of NYCHA residents? How would you prepare for that? How would you change your response? I just want everyone to think about that a little bit and just put my cards on the table and say, this is where I think we need to be headed. I think resident engagement is nice, especially if done well, and I think we're refining that as we go. But in the current conditions of NYCHA, ask for more than that. We just need to get past this moment. If this sounds radical, it is. But at the same time, it's what they've been doing in London for a generation. The mayor of London 2 years ago passed a bill that requires every public housing regeneration project in London to go to a tenant vote. And 51% of the tenants have to vote in favor. You can have development scheme A or development scheme B or nothing at all, and the tenants have to vote. So it's incumbent upon the developers to come up with a strategy that works for the residents. And then you go back together to the Public Housing Authority and say, this is what we want to do together. It really flips the script on how to move forward in public housing. So now I'd like to introduce Clare Devine and Daniela Mecozzi from Arc-Atelier to share their perspective on resident engagement. We met with them in London and their presentation really blew us away. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your incredible work. Clare?
You have to start the video? Yeah. Why?
Hi, and welcome from London. I'm going to switch us quite quickly, given the time we have, on to share the screen to see about our presentation. Hopefully everybody can see it. Just a second. Okay, can everyone see it? Hi, okay, so welcome from London on a sunny, slightly sunny afternoon. Today we are going to talk to you a little bit about what community engagement means on the ground in London. And just to give you 2 minutes about ourselves, so my role, and I will be speaking today given we have a limited amount of time. I'm Clare Devine. I trained as an architect and worked in practice for over 20 years. I moved from small-scale practice through to large-scale architectural practice, and then into multidisciplinary design practice, working across housing, public sector buildings such as schools, civic and public buildings. And then following that, I moved into government and acted as an advisor for government on design. So I was an executive director at one of government's agencies, which was the Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, and also Design Council. So I was involved in looking much more strategically at both the London and national picture on design and the impacts of design, and also what that means for how policy moves from being policy that sits on the shelf and how it can be best enacted to realise outcomes for populations. And my business partner, Daniela, she is by training a design historian, she's a writer and a journalist, and she's also a design strategist. So we work together to look at how you unlock challenges strategically and how you engage with complex groups of stakeholders to move forward and realise the best designs with people at the very heart of them. So the evolution of engagement in the UK, I'll touch on it very briefly because Jessica's already spoken about it, but I think it's worth remembering it came from philanthropy, so private initiatives for public good, and it was developed through social services first rather than through actually housing. It was the needs that drove it first. And then post-war, the big challenge came in, as in many countries, the need for post-war housing for workers. But, and this is where there's a key link between America, and particularly New York and London, is in the 1960s, after a slew of housing had been built, there was the challenge of understanding that the housing really didn't allow the public to participate, both in planning and housing delivery. And one of the most seminal reports was the Skeffington Report, which was published by the government in 1969, but it drew on Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation. And America, we're seeing a particularly hard work in terms of how the public can be meaningfully engaged, was considered absolutely important to that report, and still is regarded as important even in recent discussions within the last 5 years on public participation. In the 1980s, there was certainly a diversification of housing delivery models and vehicles to deliver housing. And one we'll talk about in terms of the presentation today is what we called Housing Action Trusts. And these were set up by government to address the most challenging housing estates in the UK. But also there was the emergence of housing associations working with councils. And that was really about how do we look at not just housing, but homes. So what was being raised before about numbers, it's about people, and also how housing can support quality of life. Through the 1990s with the Labour government, there were significant shifts, particularly with the setup of a social exclusion unit in the Cabinet Office. And that really set policy around inclusion. How do we move to a more inclusive approach? And that in turn delivered major funds and strategies around programmes for national strategies to renew neighbourhoods, for major regeneration, and how those might engage communities. And that context is important because in the 1980s, and the project we're going to show you is 20 years old. We worked on this 20 years ago, but this shows where we got to, but where we might also move to and what this can tell us. And Stonebridge is very reflective of the period that I'm talking about because it started in the 1950s. With a very top-down approach, which was very typical of the UK at that time, and London in particular. So you can see the very classic image of the city planner, and they're also a similar one of the city architect, pointing to a model, explaining how people's homes will be delivered. And the focus, as you can see from the press at the time, was very much around space age, what we think the future might be like. There was little to no mention of what that might mean for the population. And much of the population was coming from that part of London, but into these new homes. But very little was said about who those people were or who you were designing for. We reach when we became engaged in the project, and just to reinforce, when we were interviewed, the interview did include members of the local community. What we knew of the project was the following. It had a population of 2,042, and it had 1,775 homes. That was pretty much it. But the HAT's role was really to address what the challenges were, because this gives you the idea. So you can see in the bottom right, the press from 72 about space age. The press on the left, a gun ghetto, one of the worst places in London, no-go zone, and decline and fall of an English estate was actually from the Evening Standard, which is the key London newspaper. So for people living in that area, this was the kind of media perception that was out there. Now, there were challenges, absolutely, with crime, drugs, gun crime in particular, but that was a very small section of that population that was gaining those kind of headlines. Meantime, the real population felt that they were imposed upon by a design that they were never engaged on, alienated by perceptions of people who didn't know their community, and ultimately they felt very suspicious of anyone becoming involved with them. The role of the HAT, so this is the government programmes we referenced, and this was for the most challenged estates in the UK, but particularly in England, was how do we unlock this and transform the homes, but also lives? And the first thing we did was really look, and it's interesting here, Alicka's comment, and this is a very different picture of another part of London. This was the population, and the population isn't dissimilar in its demographic now. So you can see a very diverse population, and also quite a young population, and families very concerned about what that meant for the future of their children, for themselves, but also the next generation. Also a community which were under tremendous stress, as you can see, much higher than average population on unemployment, and the perception of the area really did affect employment chances. We regularly heard of people not using the name Stonebridge because it would immediately mean that they wouldn't be selected for interview because of the perceptions of the outside world about living in that area. But equally, for those who were in employment, very challenging situations in terms of low pay. You can see this was the average weekly earnings compared to the minimum nationally and also the average nationally, so less than the average national, and bearing in mind this was London, still one of the most expensive cities in the country and still the world. So in terms of our engagement strategy, what we really focused on was that inclusion had to really be at the heart of what we did. Because first and foremost, we needed to foster conversation and build trust, because without that, we were a set of designers who really didn't understand the place or the people. And our first role was to really understand what the place was about, but really with the lead of the local population. And so the strategy included a whole set of activities. And this gives a list, but it was actually mapped out completely. And each of these aspects interrelated. So first and foremost, we had home visits and interviews with people to really understand the place, but also to look at what methods and tools we could work with to really help understand what was important about the place, what people were prioritising, and how we might best design the development with them. On this list, you'll see highlighted training. Training is absolutely fundamental. It's like anyone else. If I walked into a completely new world, why would anyone expect me to understand the language or how it works or what the processes are or how you prioritise? Yet we ask people to do that. We can't ask them to help be involved in decision making if we don't give them the tools and the training to do so. And it went as far as then through workshops, but also we developed advocates within the community, and we did have members of the community who were in work placement. So we were actually looking at employment opportunities, both in the design, but also in the construction and in the delivery. ultimately the legacy of the project. But those roles of seeing the community being integral, not just to give their view, but participating in the process was absolutely key. And so what did that do for us? And I'm saying this maybe to fellow designers or developers. The evolution wasn't just the community. The evolution was us as designers and developers. We completely changed our position in our view. And it allowed both us working with the community to gain insight and understanding, which we would never otherwise have. As Jessica said, that is something that's unique to the community, and that drove the design. And I'll explain how it went about driving the design. And forgive me, I'm using some top line diagrams without getting into great technical detail. So we talked about design for living, and that was the premise, is that the built environment is basically the fabric that supports us living our life. So we looked at everything from macro to micro. So we engaged with the community on the master plan, from density and scale through to urban realm and public spaces, right then through to their homes, the layouts of those homes, the fixtures and fittings that went into them, the materials, how the landscape and planting worked, because we wanted people to be able to be engaged in that and understand from the macro to the micro how things impact on each other, but also how we can design something that is long lasting. But in addition to long lasting, we were designing for adaptable and flexible. And this absolutely came from the community. It was the engagement with them that set the approach that we took to the design. So this was a community you saw before in the photographs, that it was a very uniform. The flats actually internally weren't too bad at all, but the external appearance and the public space, which no one felt they had any control or ownership over, meant that it seemed very anonymous. On top of that, residents were regularly moved from flat to flat if their circumstances changed. So a child reaching a certain age, or an additional children born, or a member of the family who had a disability, or an aging member of the family. Part of this was also the community wanted to try to be able to stay with neighbours they had before. So the first thing we looked at with them is, could we come up with a footprint for the building that meant, and for those of you who I'm sure who are involved in master plans, you know how often these things in master plans change, accommodation change. This was changing on a week-to-week basis of people coming into the development and out because it was an existing community. So we developed a footprint that would really work, and it worked to what we call in the UK Parker-Morris standards, which was a government-driven earlier standard that stemmed from the 60s, which was a very good standard of accommodation in terms of footprint that you provided in homes, so the number of square meters. And so the module worked that homes could be basically the same width, but could increase in either depth or height to provide additional accommodation, which meant if we found during the design people were moving in or out, it didn't mean that you had to completely replan or relocate houses, or people who wanted to be in the same street as neighbours suddenly couldn't be anymore. Now this sounds like a very kind of small issue, but actually when you multiply it across thousands of people and changing sets of circumstances, it's important. And it's important in the sense that also people didn't feel they would be relocated off the estate if their accommodation changed, or that they would no longer be in the company of their neighbours, who sometimes they've been in that company in the same block for maybe 20 plus years. That moved from the master plan level down into their homes. So as you can see, the plans on the right show the typical type of housing. It was a form of what we call townhouses. But the principle that was set was that the external walls are load bearing and nothing internally is. So the loading sat on the outside faces of the building, which allowed the footprint internally to be utterly flexible. And so what that meant, for example, on an upper floor is that you can take accommodation that might on one floor have 2 double bedrooms. But as your children get older, you can choose to take one of those bedrooms and split it into two, so 2 teenage single bedrooms. And the rooms, as I say, were designed to Parker Morris, which is a good standard. But that allowed it to be very flexibly adapted because it was a timber frame inside. And that means that what we did was we built into the walls the framing for another door. We built into the heating system the outlets that could add another radiator, so that if those circumstances changed, the houses could be very economically adapted. So that's at a house level where we were doing that, but then move into the next level of detail, and this is why I'm talking from macro to micro. In order to divide rooms, the one thing that you have to have are windows into those rooms. So the window system we designed, and we used the opportunity, and all of this had to be done on sets of budgets, was to look at how could we use our buying power with the first 200 houses to go to window manufacturers and talk about, can we design a set of systems for this? This is the challenge we have. How can we work with you to design a system for the windows that would allow us to build in this kind of flexibility? Now, with that, you have to have a client who has the determination to see this through. And Anne Byrne, who happens to be the client now 25 years later, and that's what I would say to you designers, work with good clients, give them good solutions, and you work with them for many, many years. We're working with her 25 years later in Woodbury Down, but she was a brave client who pushed and said, I'm willing to commit to these kind of challenges and unlocking these kind of solutions. So she asked us to look at cost and value and the construction life and how it would be maintained and how do we procure a window manufacturer who just uses standard windows to do this. And for those of you who are involved in manufacturing, you know tooling can be incredibly expensive. But also that's the upfront cost and also the warranties. How do you make sure that this will last and it can be easily maintained? And we went through all of those with window manufacturers, and the window manufacturer we used not only used this on this project, but what he learned, he used on other public housing projects. So the value that it spread wasn't just to the project, it was with the partners and the suppliers. And so what did that mean? It meant that we had a series of houses. So these houses show you from 2-bed through to 5- and 6-bed of townhouses that could be easily located and relocated because of the widths that we'd set that worked for a range of different house types, but also that those rooms could be split, as I had said before, from large doubles into very good single bedrooms across floors, because the window systems allowed us to do that. And so that meant families, the purpose of this was to reconfigure homes so that people can stay in the homes they want to be in. And what did that mean? Well, this is the reality of how it was developed with different types of materials, but with a language that everybody felt they knew. And this architecture was developed with residents because the form followed the function that we were looking at for. The function and the flexibility they needed was delivered in the design. And that in turn was then developed into accommodation apartments as well. So looking at how do we start to scale that up. And these, as you imagine, in the 80s were smaller scales of buildings, but also these have been developed into much larger blocks of flats as the scheme has increased in scale. So what did that mean initially? The first point was it started to get the message out, and this was from The Guardians, which is a national paper in the UK. And this was a journalist coming to see the development, recognizing this is a step change because this is driven by ideas about and the practicalities that people in the population, local population, bring in terms of how they want to live in the future and what that means for their lives. And so the flexibility in the plan, in the elevation, and also the fact that it's possible to do this on budgets was an important message for the client to get out, for the house builder to get out, and for the community themselves to be able to show that they'd driven this kind of change. But that was the step that you might say was the minds part. So if we're looking at hearts and minds, the minds part was, this is how we practically do it. But the step change again for us as designers and as the client had as well was the next evolution was, okay, we've worked with people to look at engagement that drives design, but let's look at how we can work with residents to design the engagement in the first place. And the experience of building those buildings led us to work with residents to really design a completely different engagement project. And this was taking the idea we talked about. We've now worked with this first group of residents to really look at the place, but how do we get this out to the rest of the community? How do we work with the whole community of Stonebridge? And the key thing there was, traditionally, to show a house, you would have a show house. But that show house was to be about the social history of Stonebridge. It was taking those first points that we made about the press, the bad coverage it has, and actually say, this is a place about people, and these people have a rich and interesting history, and they're telling you about it. So the premise that was set and agreed with residents about how we collectively developed this was that it should reflect the individual and collective stories over the 50 years. So from the point of the design of in the 50s of Stonebridge to its current position 50 years later. It should be intergenerational, taking the memories of people from 5 to 81. It should build the confidence and empower people, not who've just been engaged in the process so far, but those who are going to engage and are nervous about what it means to lose your home and take a leap of faith to move into something new. And there was a budget. So residents were given a relocation fund of £2,000 to buy new furnishing and fittings when they moved home. And that was agreed would be the budget for this project so that we could say this was what was spent in delivering it. So how did we do it? We had questions, interviews, sessions with people, talking about their domestic work and social life, using memory, but this was really about heart stuff. This was about, what does home mean to you? This is not unit numbers. This is a place where people are living their lives. And so we started it, designing it with the idea of a poster campaign. So parodying Marmite, do you love or hate it? And it was Stonebridge hat. So do they hate the hat? Love the place? Bottom line is, most people hate Marmite, but they love Stonebridge and they love the place, despite what the press might say. As I say, we interviewed people in their homes. And this is the billboard that people chose for outside of the house. And it really was to focus, inclusion begins at home, but they chose Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs because people talked about family is whatever you choose to make it. It can be friends, it can be relatives, but it's about a feeling of being included. And it was immediately to say, it has a different perspective. We have a different perspective on what family and home means. And we designed the home with residents, and so everything you're about to see, you might look and think, well, it can be fun and quirky. There are really hard-hitting messages behind it. And the importance of making people feel that they could come to this place. So the idea was to design this home, not just for the community came in their thousands, but also for those who are involved in more bureaucratic roles. So everything from those who are involved in building control, planning, for the developers, for future architects who are going to work on the scheme. This was to really say, this is what the place is about, and people. And what you can see on the left-hand side these were the themes that people drew out. Family and friends were really important to them. That was what home was for them. About visual, what do we see in our home? About the sense of smell and memory, sound and music was incredibly important. So we had smells piped through the home that were chosen by the resident. We had music playing that they had selected. And we took the history and incorporated it in different ways through the building. So starting, I'm going to take you a very quick journey around the house. And the reason you don't see people in this one is because it's through the eyes of the residents. What we did do was we commissioned a photographer who worked on major newspapers to give the residents a sense of, we want the photographs to be the best they can, because you know what, we're going to use this to publish what we are, not just our local community and local papers, but also to the press, the ones who've been criticising us so much. So starting in the hallway, this is really to say, there was this sense of them being insular as a community. This was a well-travelled community, a community who came from all over the world and travelled to all over the world. And that was a richness that nobody talked about. Moving from there into the living area, people selected pieces of furniture from the 50s, 60s, 70s, including plants. We had to spend time with residents going to second-hand shops, markets, IKEA, Muji, all these kind of different places, and also borrowing things from residents. Some of the things you can see here were borrowed from residents because nobody starts a home with everything brand new. And through that, also, the friends and family, we couldn't use photographs of friends and family. So with residents, they decided they wanted to use role models. So throughout the home, you will see photographs, and those are people selected by voting by residents about who they wanted to see. And these were role models for them that they felt were empowered people who took action. The objects you can see there, all borrowed from residents. And so some things were bought, some things found, and some things borrowed. Throughout the home, there were certain things. So for example, very British thing, the drinks and the soda siphon were about a period of time that people felt from entertaining in homes. Sideboards at that time, remember this is 20 years ago, not mid-century modern in the way we look at it now. 20 years ago, this was the kind of furniture people had and was borrowed for the show house. But also drinks that they had, drinks that they used to celebrate, things that conjured up memories of people coming together. Also keepsakes and mementos. These were mementos from family and travel, and also, as you can see, family photographs, and they chose shows that really resonated with them from their childhood and other parts of their life. But again, how a home is really about, it's a vehicle to hold all those memories and keepsakes. Equally, moving on from the living room into the kitchen, the idea of flavours and family recipes and families coming together, and what foods people had as children, but what that meant to them and what it conjured up to them about their memories of family and life. And you can see very diverse, given it was a very diverse population, and this is where I think we always learn never to assume anything. The most popular food by the entire resident community was a British roast, Sunday roast. So despite everything, everybody seemed to align to that. We also looked through the eyes of a child. As I said, it was a very young population, a large percentage of the population young. But also people themselves, adults, were very driven by memories from their childhood. And what that meant in terms of how they passed the time, how they passed the day, what time meant to you as a child, but also what triggered memories. And those were things from the kind of games they played. So you can see this was a resident who was 21, and she said how exciting it was for her to be in it. And the walkways, which were in the big blocks, which lots of people said were incredibly negative. Obviously, she spent her time doing Kiss, Cuddle and Torture, which is a British game where you learn a lot of social skills. But she didn't see it that way. Her childhood wasn't marred by this, and I think that's really important given the press. But also, all of these toys were toys that were selected by residents to say these generated, they meant a period, different periods in time for us. The t-shirt on the right, which says, what room, where were you most happiest? And it said, whatever room mummy was in, came from a 25-year-old man who couldn't believe he'd said it, but he had, and all these things were taped, so all the interviews were taped, and the quotes that were used were from residents within the area. Friendship was incredibly important to people, and sense of what that meant, and having the structures for friendship, and those being the solid foundations of a community in childhood were really important. Moving on to the teenagers, so for young people, that was a key driver for them. They really engaged with the show house, and they're often a demographic that aren't involved. So we engaged them really closely about. And they talked about not just, again, with them, about intergenerational. Where are your parents from? Where were your grandparents from? What does that mean? What influences has that had? Very important to get that message out. And they were really interested in talking about that and what their history was and what their future might be. This was the kind of comments that we also got back, which was about reflecting a frustration of not being heard. And these are really important for us to incorporate. But also, and I talked about the photos of families and friends, action heroes. Action heroes were hugely important. People like Pam Greer, because people felt these were people who took charge of things, made things happen for themselves. And whilst you may look at these and think they're amusing, interesting, it's photogenic, actually there's a really powerful message there about what people felt was the biggest barriers for them and why they looked to these kind of individuals. But as well as action heroes, they also looked at agents for change. They were looking to people who changed cultural life, who changed socio-economic life, that made major changes to life. And they wanted those kind of, the idea that the future could be better and they could have a say in it were incredibly important. Equally, when we move into the parents' room, and I have to say Charles Bronson, who you can see on the right-hand side there, he was one of the key figures for adults. Again, an action hero, somebody who took on the system and made change. But also the harsh reality, and this was a reality that we wanted many people to see, and residents were very keen to understand that when you saw that the information on people's earning or unemployment, these were people, this was the average time that adults got up in the morning. So you're looking at people who are working incredibly hard, often with early starts in the morning or late finishes at night. And being in an area that doesn't feel safe has a huge impact. Adults really wanted everyone to understand this is the kind of hours that they had to deploy to make a life. And so they wanted to feel both safe and also sound. And sound was really important because people got up so early in the morning, actually radio was hugely important to them. And they talked about how music and news at that time of the morning set the tone of the day. But also being such a diverse community, they also looked to figures that maybe we didn't expect. They looked to people like the Queen and said, well, it's the idea of service and giving to your community. They also looked to things like sports, so sports heroes, and certainly cricket came out as incredibly important, but figures who influenced adults, but also children. This gives you a sense of the home as a whole. And what happened with that house? Well, it had a broad and diverse outreach. The aim was to get people who may be too worried or too uncertain or lacking in confidence, whose homes may be in the future phases, to come and visit, to see a completed home, but also to see themselves reflected in that home. So we had over 2,500 visitors in the first 2 weeks. It was then open for another 2 weeks. Residents did say to us they would have liked it to be open for forever, but unfortunately there was somebody with very desperate housing needs who had the house. But certainly what it did was it became the community centre during that period and certainly informed how we went forward in engagement. And so it built confidence. It also brought collaboration and empathy, I think, was one of the most important things. Empathy between those in the council, the broader consultant team and the residents. But it also set a set of community pride and I say a sense of ownership, because this was a show house really driven by the residents. So the first priority was, as we say, for the residents, but the one that also was important to them was that we could counteract the national press and international press. So buying press in the UK to have a double page spread in a national newspaper at that time was about £30,000 to £40,000. The fact that we could reach local, national, international press and have major articles written about the place and the people and the role they took in transforming their area was hugely important to them. And people used this information themselves to promote what they're doing. There was a real sense of pride. But also, and we're less concerned about awards, but those awards were more to do with the residents seeing that their approach, both to public participation, but also the role they took in the design, was recognised by others. It was recognised in the UK and it was recognised with European awards. And what that meant was, and there were a myriad of different housing types come out, this is just an example of one, was it set a culture and an attitude for the rest of the regeneration of Stonebridge. And regeneration of Stonebridge has been going on for 20 years. So we're looking at something that has been done in the last 5 years, but that culture and attitude of engaging the community and working with them has been hugely important. So what does that mean for us as an organisation, as Arc-Atelier, and how that's influenced us? Well, the evolution has then been of how do we move from the engaging of people and their involvement, which we've been doing for the last, as I say, 20 years, into the participation of people. And behind all the end results of the show house or the buildings that you see has to be something that sits behind all of that to organise that process. So as Alicka and Jessica have mentioned, there was the visit to Woodbury Down, and we've worked with Woodbury Down off and on probably for about the last 6 years. And at the moment, there's the mention of the independent tenant advisors. So we are the independent design advisors. And the reason we're there is, as you can see from Stonebridge, we were talking about in the 80s more low-scale development. In London, we're seeing, as in many parts of the country, higher density, more complex developments. And this is Woodbury Down in North London. It has the great fortune to be set on a reservoir. But the original estate had equally very similar challenges to those in Stonebridge, different demographic, but similar types of challenges. We've involved in the regeneration of this project, which involves a complex and multi-stakeholder group. Now, our role is to think, how can we work with the groups to design people-centred approaches and systems with people? And this is all the participants. This is the community, it's the developer, it's the housing association, and it's the council, because it's about embedding it in every part of the partnership that is involved in the delivery. Because if the community believe in it, but the council doesn't, or the developer doesn't, then it will never succeed. So our role has really been to look at, there are 4 key partners: Woodco, which is the Woodbury Down Community Organisation on the right. There's then starting to the left is Berkeley Homes, the developer, the council, Hackney Council, Notting Hill Genesis, who are the housing association, who will ultimately take and manage and maintain the homes going forward. So in London, I'm sure like New York, there are a myriad of stakeholders and parties you would engage with. Some of those are statutory, and some of those are really important partners who are stakeholders who can really help deliver the development. On top of that, you have a myriad of other policy, guidance, principles, all that influence the development. And sometimes this can all seem utterly overwhelming, and particularly for residents who hear all of these things. And our role is to set a structure around this to make it manageable and achievable, and also to make sure that there's some very simple, clear messages that are going through like a golden thread through the approach. And so taking all of this, our role is then to think about how do we design with the partners a process. And you can see at the bottom, this is the work stages. I'm sure you have something very similar, looking at how an architect and a development would be designed. And it's very linear and you follow a process. But how do we make that personal, and how do we engage people? And so our first approach is to really identify the challenges. And those challenges can sit in policy, because we want to enact the policy. We want to make sure any development really delivers on policy objectives. We also use research in the area. We draw on the best guidance because what we want to be able to show is what is the source of the challenges we're trying to address? What's the source of the problems that are in the area, and how can we be clear what the development's going to try and address? Added to that, the next layer down is inclusion. So how do we ensure that this is socially, economically and environmentally inclusive? And that's embedded in everything we do. So if we're going to start looking at this development, how do we do that? And the first thing is also that we look at inclusion absolutely embedded in how we operate. So that means in the governance. Now governance, lots of people sigh it. When I worked with government and lots of communities across the country, governance is hugely important. It sets the terms by how you will operate. So if I'm sitting there and I'm a developer and I'm thinking, goodness, this could get completely out of control and I'm really worried about what people will think is open for discussion, it sets how we will operate and the means and rules for operating. And we often have communications with different groups, whether it's residents or others. It's all about whatever it is must be viable. We have to be able to deliver it. Otherwise, we have really interesting conversations and nothing happens. So it's about managing expectations, but also delivering on them. So that involves everything from how we communicate, how do we create clarity, and also what are the decisions that we are looking to make, and what does it mean to make a decision or not go back on a decision, or sometimes adjust a decision, because the nature of development is always changing. But also an understanding of context. So as well as the people, what's the history of the place? What is the character? What is it? Because those are the assets that sit in the community. And understanding those are phenomenally important, because that's when you start to feed the challenges, the inclusion, the operation, the context, all feed into what the opportunity could be. And it means when you develop a vision or objectives or principles of how you will work, they're set on a solid foundation because they understand the areas above. But all of this means nothing unless you empower people. So what we want to do is move people from being engaged to enabled to empowered. To move people to be enabled and empowered, you have to understand the culture. You have to have a clear approach to communication. You have to know about information and insights, and you have to understand what people's skills and capabilities are. And by that, I mean everybody, not just residents. These are the designers, the officers in the council, the officers in the housing association, because the first thing we do is a workshop to talk about our skills and capabilities, because we all have something to learn, and all of us learning something actually makes those who are participating feel that this is a much more equitable process. We then look at designing methods and tools to work with the community, and also what's the impact we're seeking to achieve and how might we evaluate that. And all of those are important, because when you bring together those 6 layers, that's how you create well-designed places. It's well-designed places happen, we believe, because people understand the process, they're absolutely empowered and engaged in it, and they understand when challenges happen, how to manage those challenges collectively. So the list you can see below of 1 to 10 is the government's National Design Guide. That shows you what they consider to be important in designing places. And we absolutely agree with those things. That's what makes well-designed places. But particularly now in the UK, over the last 5 years, we're seeing huge challenges in other areas, and COVID exacerbating many of those challenges. So what we're interested in is moving from well-designed places into places that perform well, particularly for people. So that means in looking at design, it's not just about the number of homes, it's how you embed inclusion into how a place operates, how it takes into account people's health and well-being, that it deals with ages such as ageing and isolation, that it is a place that is intergenerational, sustainable and affordable, and ultimately one that's resilient. And this takes us back to where we were 20 years ago with Stonebridge, involving people, understanding hearts and minds about how we engage and design places. So our approach is therefore we are looking to develop well-performing places for people. That means a diversity of voices that are inclusive. There's an inclusive approach so that their insight can be garnered, so that we can design places that really are innovative and really perform for people. Hope that's of interest.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Daniela and Claire. Really appreciate you being here. We originally heard this presentation when we were in London. I think I had a full range of emotions, you know, so excited about the deep view of tenant engagement that you were able to have. And then kind of in the middle started to worry a minute about, you know, is this the solution we're looking for? There was a moment where I started to worry, like, we need an art installation about the history of the public housing residents. And then I started to get my sort of New York sarcasm started creeping in. And then the more I thought about it, the more enthusiastic I was, where this is really emblematic of the kind of work that's being done in the UK, where if the history and the memory and the experiences of the residents are elevated in this way, this is just, there's all different kinds of medium that we need to use in order to make that really true, despite how often we say we want it to be true. And then I also just want to reflect on some of the design choices that the residents made, some of the feedback that we heard. There's some concerns when we present this here in New York City that public housing residents couldn't possibly understand the types of budgetary constraints that are faced by a developer or by a city agency. That's actually not the kind of issues that we heard from in London. When we asked for very, very specific design details that the tenants were requesting in the London context, they were not expensive. So we heard one story where the developer had created this kind of typical open plan design that's kind of modern and sexy and of the moment. And the tenant said, no, I want to be cooking dinner and I want the kids over there. So please, let's put the wall back up between the kitchen and the living room. And that was actually less expensive for the developer. We also heard them looking at the floor plans in such great detail that they saw that the laundry closet was sort of as tight as possible, because a lot of times developers like to maximize the usable space in the room. And the developer said, then the resident said, well, can you make the laundry closet a little bit bigger actually? Because we need to have shelving in there so we can put the laundry and the soap and everything else we need to do laundry. So these were not costly changes. They were changes based on how residents actually lived. And they either didn't cost anything or actually saved the developer money if they bothered to take the time to get to know folks. So I think the biggest sort of gut punch for me of this presentation is really that that first slide where you see the photo of the urban planner with the blueprint in front kind of pointing like, yes, this is what we shall do. And, you know, that's a photo from the 1950s. And it just kind of hurts to, as an urban planner myself, to feel like we haven't quite gotten that far past that in all this time. I'll just close, you know, there's a couple questions in the chat. If you have other questions, let us know, and then we'll wrap up. I know we're over time, but I also want to share in New York City the kind of questions that we'd heard from public housing residents at NYCHA when we start floating this idea with public housing tenants. So not asking for the sun and the moon and the stars at all, as opposed to what a government person, like in my former position, would review for an RFP process. We heard NYCHA residents say, can people come at night? I need the developer to come visit this place at night so they can really see what it's like in the evenings when it's dark out. We heard people ask about what are the office hours for your property management staff for the central office. So these are kind of questions that, you know, if you're a standard devoted middle manager at a government agency, that's not important to you in your job. What are the office hours of the property manager? But for a NYCHA resident, that's everything, because you need to see if it works with your work schedule. So it's not a better or a worse view. It's just more focused on the day-to-day lived experience of the tenants in the building. It's not going to break the bank. And there's just a lot of real, true expertise that we should, you know, stop paying lip service to and start actually doing something about. So I'm going to take a look in the Q&A. Yes, we will send a copy of the PowerPoint. And so, yeah, I encourage everybody to take a look. I want to thank our panelists, Claire and Daniela and Alicka. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank all of the public housing residents and activists and everybody else who joined us on the trip to London back in December before everything in the world changed. And I want to encourage you all to take a look at CHPC's website, where we have the report that summarizes what we learned from London, as well as a catalog that we call the Resident Engagement Toolkit that has an actual tenant ballot, an actual MOU between a tenants association and a developer, an actual description of what 3 different menu options of development schemes might be. So you can really see how on the ground this might look. And some of them are gonna seem very, very normal and doable. And some of them are gonna really blow your mind about what that might look like to accomplish this here in New York City. So this administration has 15 months left to really show that they're serious about moving public housing forward in the city. We really want to work with you as a partner to make that a reality here in New York on behalf of NYCHA residents. And we really hope that we can really start honoring the memory and the history and the expertise of NYCHA residents, because it's the only way that the new housing that we build is going to be reflective of that need. So thank you so much again to our panelists, and I want to thank everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you. Can you still see these?